The World Benchmarking Alliance was launched in September on the march of the United Nations General Assembly with the aims to develop, fund, house, and safeguard free, public available corporate sustainability benchmarks aligned with SDGs. And Vicky has actually joined the team in 2019, and after spending some time, a number of years on the energy and commodity side of ABN AMRO, and she's the lead on the energy and on site for the World Benchmark Alliance. And Nathan is more on the food and agricultural side, and that's where he'll be focusing on. So can I hand over to the presentation of Vicky and Nathan? Thank you very much, people.
Thank you, Grant, for the introduction, and yeah, good morning or afternoon for wherever you are in the world. And so pleased to see so many of you joining, and that the Zoom fatigue is not real with you guys yet. But yeah, it's great to be invited to this group, and thank you for that. And yeah, Nathan and I will take the next, I would say, 25 minutes to explain a little bit more about the World Benchmarking Alliance, and we would like to share some examples as well of the work that we've already done, but also please consider this to be an interactive session if you want to. So if you have any questions, share them in the chat, so we will be able to answer yeah, if there are any questions. So as Grant already mentioned, the World Benchmarking Alliance, probably not a household name for a lot of you yet, but we've been founded or we started the work in September 2018 with the idea and the vision to create a movement to drive private sector's contribution in the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we do so by developing methodologies and public available methodologies and benchmarks that we will publish. So can I have the next slide, Bruno? Thank you. So we do so because we believe that benchmarking is a tool to drive companies' behavior and to drive private sector behavior, and to also measure the performance of the private sector against the Sustainable Development Goals. We have done so because we believe that the private sector is a crucial stakeholder in driving and leading the transformation change that we believe that is required to deliver on the SDGs. And that's why we, as I said, we develop free and publicly available benchmarks. And that's why we are an NGO. We are mainly funded by various governments and philanthropists, because we believe that transparency and freely accessible information and data is needed to have all stakeholders to have availability of the data to engage. And our benchmarks are, as I said, are tools to not only equip the private sector for strategic decisions or directions, but also financial institutions and governments, civil society, and I will talk a little bit on that later, to have that information to engage with the private sector. And this is how we create a system to not only award and recognize leadership and to mention who are the leaders in the specific industries or transformations that these companies operate in, but also to create an accountability mechanisms for those that are lagging behind. Next slide, please. So when we started, we took, of course, the framework of the SDGs as a starting point. And then also, as probably you all know, the SDGs were not developed for the private sector. So then we had to translate the Sustainable Development Goals into another framework, which we refer to as the System Transformation Framework. And we've came up with this wheel on the right side. We've done so in cooperation with various other, oh, the sound is off. Can you hear me, guys? I hope so. Yeah, okay.
We can, yeah.
Otherwise, I would have been talking for already a while without anyone hearing, but okay, great. And the Sustainable Development Goals, and we've translated these into the 7 system transformations. I won't go into all of them. The presentation is now gone, or at least, Bruno, can you go to slide 3, please? Yeah, so I'll just continue talking. I won't go into the details, but today we will focus on the decarbonization and energy, the green one, which I'm leading. And Nathan will show you a little insight into the food system transformation. And then, as you can see, we see the circular, the digital, and the urban transformation. And then we will have the social transformation at its heart, because we believe that everything we do and measure would need to make sure that the companies that we measure also have to adhere to a minimum standard around social criteria. We've just published our methodology around measuring core social responsibility. So you're more than welcome to have a look at our website to review that, and it's open for public consultation if anyone wants to be involved. And then we have the financial system, which sits at an outer circle. On the one hand, because we believe that the financial system needs to drive and support a lot of these system transformations, and by reallocating capital or making specific investments possible. But on the other hand, the financial system in itself will need to transform. So, and these systems are all at various stages of maturity. Some have already published methodologies, others are developing benchmarks already, but some are still at a very early stage of scoping. And I'll show you what the various stages are that we go through. Next one, please. So here is, this is maybe a bit of a complicated slide, but I'll just talk you through. What we've done is, okay, we take the Sustainable Development Goals as a starting point. Then we start with scoping, which means that we look at what is the best available science already, what are standards and principles and disclosure frameworks that are already there. So, and then we look at, okay, what other indicators or areas are not yet measured, but are crucial to drive transformation. Why is that important? Because a lot of corporate reporting frameworks or standards and initiatives predate the SDGs. So we also recognize that if we really want to see transformative change, we would need to measure different things. Hence, we always start with the scoping, because we do not want to replicate what's already out there. We want to continuing building on any existing standards and principles, and then design a framework that really drives the transformation to the next level. Next, please. Yeah, so here, and this is a quick slide to show you that we start with the, after we've done the scoping, we will start with the methodology development, and we always do so in working groups to involve all the stakeholders that we deem are important in the end also to use the benchmark as a tool. So we always involve industry representatives. We always we make sure that civil society is represented, because we want to make sure that the methodology is reflective of societal expectations. We find it very important to have financial voices in there, the financial services sector. And we want to make sure that in the end science is represented, so that whatever methodology we come up with is actually scientifically correct, and is also making sure that it's reflective of society's expectations. Then we always publish the methodology for public consultation outside of the working group that has worked on the methodology, to make sure that we gather as much input as possible. And then we go to, once we've approved of the methodology, we will go into the data collection, and then in the verification and analysis mode before we publish the benchmarks. Next, please, slide, please. So, and we do so, as I said, by empowering various stakeholders. So on the first hand, the individual companies play a really important role. We are very independent. So the companies can use us as a tool, but it's not that companies are part of the influence, other than inputting on methodology development. Then financial institutions, so banks as well as investors. We have active investor engagements with various investor groups. Civil society, as I mentioned. Governments, we have a policy unit in Brussels, Washington, and in Delhi, to make sure that whatever benchmark and results we publish provides the feedback loop. So to policymakers to see, okay, what policy works and what doesn't, and I'll give an example on that later. And then in the end, it's the individuals. Individuals could be employers of the companies that we benchmark, but it could also be the consumers when they buy a specific product of one of or services from one of the companies that we've benchmarked. Next one, please. So as I said, as a first, we are it's in our name, World Benchmarking Alliance. And the alliance is very important because we are building a movement. As I said, it's one of that's our vision, which means that in the meantime, we are over 130 allies. These are 130 organizations that support our work, not financially, but they support this by contributing to methodology development, by providing feedback, by making sure that, as I said, the work that we produce remains relevant. And these allies consist of various organizations, and this is just a snapshot, and it's growing by the day. So this number is already outdated because in the meantime, last week more joined. But you can see it's very much spread over the world, but also across various different type of organizations. And you can find the names of all our allies on our website. But it's very important, as I said, also the benchmarks and the standards platform like, you know, SASB, GRI, CDP, they're part of our alliance. And this is important to make sure that we don't replicate, as I said, what's already been done by other organizations. And we have academics, governmental organizations, and consultancies. So I don't know where all of you are at, but maybe one of the companies that you work for is already an ally. And if not, we're always you know, open for to grow this movement further. Next slide, please. Then to go into an example, because Grant asked me to, you know, this is all very nice and theoretical, but can you come up with an example? So we will dive into, as I said, two of the system transformations a bit more closely. One is the decarbonization and energy transition. As you probably all know, climate change is the single biggest threat to development, and I would say next to the pandemic, obviously, that we're currently experiencing. And as we need to see a major decarbonization and energy transformation. And here, of course, we, I think from decarbonization transformation, we are lucky because in that sense, we have the Paris agreements that everyone sort of agrees to. So we have a sort of a common measurement that we can look for, which is to keep global warming to well below 2 degrees scenario. And that's what our various benchmarks will do. We will measure how the private sector is setting targets and how they are measuring their performance against the Paris Agreement. And we do so with, you know, to engage the private sector with governments and civil society. For this transformation, yeah, you can go to this slide, it's fine. We've partnered up with CDP, as I mentioned, one of the standards disclosure platforms, and ADEME, which is the French environmental agency. CDP and ADEME have developed a methodology that is truly measuring the transformation. So what is a low carbon transition for a specific industry and what does that mean? So what we will do is we will measure 450 companies against the Paris Agreement goals. And we do so by using this ACT methodology, which stands for Assessing Low Carbon Transition. And these, the publication of these benchmarks will be in high emitting sectors. So we've done in the automotive industry, which I'll show you. On the 6th of July, we will publish our research on the electric utility industry. And we've just published a consultation on the oil and gas methodology that we've developed together with the Science Based Target Network. I don't know if you are aware, but that's also, they use a specific science to develop then specific industry measures. And we expect for the oil and gas that we will measure 100 companies by the beginning of next year. So we see as well that by publishing this will give an insight not only into individual performances, but also how a whole industry is performing. And then what is the, you know, if you're one of the companies in our ranking, then you can also see how you're performing against your peers, or at least the peers that we have selected for this specific benchmark. Next slide, please. So, as I said, we've published the automotive ranking. I just need to move my screen. Yeah. One of the outcomes, we've published this in December last year. And one of the things that was pretty clear is that the automotive industry is not on track to meet the Paris Agreement. So this is what the ranking would look like. You can see number one, Group PSA, and number two, BMW. They came in quite close, as you can see on the overall score. But this is also not an absolute ranking, it's a relative ranking. So it is the fact that, you know, Group PSA is coming in first in this benchmark, but it doesn't mean that they are aligned with the Paris Agreement. So this is just because out of this sample, they're performing the best. But the overall conclusion is that the full industry needs to move further. And as I said, one of the policy, we can go to the next slide. You will receive the slides afterwards, so we can see it. You can read all this in details. But the key findings from this research was that companies have been really slow to decarbonize, and that they are not selling enough electric vehicles in that sense to be able to decarbonize the way that they should. We also we see that companies are not redirecting the consumers away from high emitting vehicles. So one of the things that we measure is how do companies engage with their customers to inform them about what low carbon transition options are available. And we also see that, you know, as one of the key elements in these high emitting sectors is there is a strong policy influence by these companies. And we see that these companies are not necessarily lobbying for, you know, the right climate regulations. And as you probably also have read, is you see that quite a lot of these high emitting sectors are now asking for regulatory holidays due to COVID. So we also see that they're not using their influence in the right way. And one other finding was as well, you see that the European car companies are actually ahead of the rest of the world, which was driven also by regulatory measurements that's been put in place. But these regulations have actually only resulted in incremental change or incremental performance improvement, which meant that they actually improved the efficiency of the low carbon or of the internal combustion engine. But if we talk about transformational change, actually what we need to see is the phase out of the internal combustion engine. We also measure what are the investments, how do companies make investments, how do they invest in new changes, and also how are they developing their activities, for example, in the automotive industry beyond vehicle ownership. I saw that there's some questions coming in. While Nathan will give you an example about the food system that we're working on, I'll read the questions and I'll answer these afterwards. So next slides. I think we're over to Nathan. Yeah. Nathan, over to you.
Thanks, Vicky. Morning, everyone. I'm just trying to put my screen on full. Yeah, so thanks. As Vicky said, I'm going to give a brief overview of the work that WBA is doing in the food and agriculture space, and wary of time, hopefully I'll be able to cover the approach we're taking with a focus really on how we're collaborating in this space with a number of existing initiatives and work streams that are going on already in food and agriculture. So the first point to note on our benchmark is that we're taking a unique approach with our food and agriculture benchmark due to the value chain approach that we're taking. You see on the diagram there from input companies all the way upstream, all the way through the entire value chain to food service and retail companies furthest downstream in the chain. So the scale of this approach and the variety of companies that are included means that this is a somewhat unique approach compared to the work that's gone before. Within each of those broad 6 value chain segments, there's a number of sub-industries. So for instance, seed, fertilizer, and agrochemical being inputs, dairy, livestock, poultry, and seafood and proteins, and cocoa, sugar, grains, oilseeds, among others, will be in the products and commodities section. The benchmark takes a food-centric approach, so we don't include companies or industries such as cotton, tobacco, or timber. So when it came to the company selection, we have some selection principles around how to select these, predominantly based on their size and influence in the industries in which they sit. The resultant list is a diverse mix, so we have the usual suspects that everyone would expect to see in a benchmark looking at food and agriculture, but also some that will probably be less familiar to most stakeholders. And that's partly because we try to ensure, as far as possible, a global presence with the benchmark and an equitable spread of geographies as far as possible. Unsurprisingly, given the size of these companies, the large number of them are either vertically or horizontally integrated. We know that, for instance, the commodity trading market is highly concentrated at the high end. And we're also seeing through our work that a number of, for instance, livestock companies are also manufacturing their own animal feed and processing their own products as well. You can see at the bottom that we've tried to ensure a mix of ownership types alongside the geographic diversity. And we estimate that the companies have got around 6 trillion USD in their annual revenue. So hopefully that gives you an overview of the scale of the approach to start with. Next slide, please, Bruno. So in terms of our methodological approach, I think this links back to what Vicky was saying earlier about looking at the existing frameworks and standards which are already out there. So the benchmark itself is not an intent to reinvent the wheel in this space or to come up with an entirely new way of thinking. Instead, what we're trying to do is translate existing agendas, which Vicky also said they're not typically or not always geared towards the private sector. So we're trying to translate these agendas into a framework that makes sense for the private sector and also gives them a roadmap for the coming decade as we move towards 2030 and the culmination or the endpoint of the SDGs. So over the last couple of years, there's been numerous reports released around the theme of the urgent need for food transformation. You can see a number of them on the screen. So from organizations such as the FAO, the World Resource Institute, Eat Lancet, the Food and Land Use Coalition, IPCC, and the Food Climate Research Network, among others. There's just a few examples. However, what we found when we've done our research is that a number of these reports, or a lot of these reports, they'll come up with their own agendas or action points or priorities towards what we should be focusing on for a food system transformation. So our framework and the work we've undertaken is to try and capture the complementary and high-level topics that emerge out of these reports and look for the consistency across them, and to transform or translate these, I guess, into a framework which you can see on the right there, which is under 3 broad and interconnected pillars. So one is nutrition and health, the second is environment, and the third is social inclusion. So some of the topics we would see included within these will be things like the double burden of malnutrition and obesity, protein diversification, food safety, biodiversity, food loss and waste, animal welfare, child and or forced labor, living wages, and land and resource rights. So these are some of the common themes that we've seen to emerge out of these reports. In addition to these reports and these organizations, we've also developed the framework in partnership with the Food Foundation and Fixing the Business of Food, which is a collaborative effort. And our work is also supported by, as it is with all of our benchmarks, WBA, an expert review committee. So in food, we have a panel of 15 experts from multiple backgrounds and sectors and geographies, and they help oversee the benchmark development process, provide input, and sign off on the approach we're taking to make sure that we're taking an approach that is satisfactory and collaborative enough to cover the themes that we need to, the key high-level themes. So again, this is just giving a bit more weight and flavor, I guess, to how we collaborate as an organization, and also give some more weight to the thinking behind the alliance, as Vicky highlighted earlier, as we move towards a common mission of transforming these systems. Next slide, please, Bruno. Yeah, hopefully I won't overcomplicate this too much, but we have a beneficial aspect of this work is that there's a number of benchmarks initiatives that have gone before. So one of the things we're trying to do with our food and agriculture benchmark is to provide a complementary effort to this work and not to overwrite or overlap work that's already in this space. So you'll see that our benchmark, as I said previously, is unique due to the scale. So what we're going to do is go for scale and look at high-level topics across the entirety of the value chain for the real key and salient points on what we need to do to transform the food system. You'll see underneath there are a number of existing benchmarks. We call these spotlight benchmarks, and we see these benchmarks as a way for stakeholders to go deeper on certain industries or issues in which they may be interested in. So personally, I've worked on, at WBA, we have a couple of these have been developed in-house at WBA. So I've personally worked on both the Access to Seeds Index, which assesses multinationals and SMEs on their relationships and contribution to smallholder farmer development in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And we also, last year at WBA released the Seafood Stewardship Index, which looks at a mix of fishing companies, aquaculture, and feed companies on their ocean stewardship. We also have a number of these spotlights amongst our ally network. So for instance, one of our allies is the Access to Nutrition Index. They take a deeper dive on multinational companies looking at themes such as product reformulation and marketing. Spot, which some of you may know as well, also carries out transparency assessments of soft commodity traders, which includes palm oil in terms of the relevance for our benchmark. So at the bottom there, you can see some ways in which we're trying to collaborate and work alongside these partners. So around metrics, data collection, engagement, these are all ongoing processes as we're in the benchmark development phase ourselves. And we're aiming to align further in the coming years and benchmark cycles. So one thing it does allow us to do is we will be able to capture high-level topics from all of these individual spotlights in the framework of our all-encompassing benchmark. But if a stakeholder is interested in more specific issues, they'll be able to go to one of these spotlight benchmarks and discover more about the issue they're particularly interested in. Next slide, please, Bruno. The final slide I just want to give a flavour of is that we feel it's vital that the World Benchmark Alliance to incorporate the perspective and views of farmers into our work. So another key stakeholder that we have. You can see that we take in the methodology development as a top-down approach of working with these existing organisations and initiatives around creating this framework, but we also think it's vitally important to have a bottom-up approach of on-the-ground consultations with farmers who are the ones who are most directly affected by the issues we're talking about and who are the ones who are going to be most directly affected by any changes that we see happen in terms of the food system. So we recently convened 2 farmer roundtables in Nepal and Kenya in late 2019. So there was 49 farmers in attendance from 14 different countries across Southeast Asia and Eastern and Southern Africa. And what we found particularly strongly to come out of these farmer roundtables is the importance of our third pillar, the one around social inclusion, with farmers really stressing the need to be treated equitably and as value chain partners to these multinationals if we want to see the systemic change in the food system. And we're looking to develop these activities further by building a farmers coalition. So we've already got one farmers cooperative on board from Nepal, and our engagement team is looking at building this more strongly in the coming months and years. So we have that voice of the farmers really solidified within our work. Again, this is quite a brief overview I've given, but I hope to give some idea of at least a flavour of the work we're doing. We are going to be releasing our methodological framework and profiles of 350 companies in scope in July for anyone who's interested. And in terms of the timeline for the Food and Agriculture Benchmark, our central point of focus is next year's UN Food and Nutrition Summit, where we'll be publishing the first full benchmark. So that'll be when we look at assessing each of the companies against the between 10 to 15 roughly topics under each of those 3 pillars and producing rankings such as the one that Vicky showed for the auto benchmark earlier in the presentation. Yeah, that's all for me. So thanks, and yeah, look forward to any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. There are a few questions. Yeah, maybe you can start with the last one that came in from Svetlana on the European farmers. And they say, okay, why are the European farmers not represented? But maybe, I don't know if you have an answer to that at this stage.
So it's a really good question. So I think the farm roundtables began as an initiative from the Access to Seeds Index, so one of the predecessors of this benchmark. And that Access to Seeds Index is primarily and centrally focused on the development of smallholder farmers. So all those events were held under the banner of the Access to Seeds Index. The 2 farmer roundtables we held in Nepal and Kenya were under the banner of both WBA and the Access to Seeds Index. So looking for a more And I'm aware that we're underway. We have talks undergoing to also develop further relationships with European farmer coalitions and cooperatives, and also in North America as well. So a point of focus. Historically, our has been on smallholder farmers, but we are going to be diversifying further in the coming weeks and months. So not just building coalitions with smallholders, but also large-scale farmers in other parts of the globe as well.
Okay, Grant, there's a little bit of background noise because I think you're not muted, but do we still have time to go through a few more questions, Grant?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question because one of the observations was on the from Nathan was on the Tesla being quite low in the automotive ranking. Is it explain that maybe because they obviously are electric cars, but obviously there's some other factors that give them a lower rating or ranking.
No, absolutely. And it's a great question, and it's one that we've answered already many times. So I can definitely go into that one because the methodology, and you will have, if you want to go to our website, you can go into the different modules that we measure the companies on, and one of course is the fleet emissions that we measure on. And as you can probably guess, the fleet emissions module for Tesla, they score really high on because there are none in terms of the fact that they are indeed all producing electric vehicles. But as I said, the methodology goes beyond that because we look into, does the company set targets, for example, for its manufacturing emissions? Does it disclose how they intend to contribute to a low carbon economy from a manufacturing point of view, but also by sharing in their investments decisions or sharing insights into the business model changes that we ought to see? And as you can also, how transparent are they about governance structures or policy or lobbying influence, as I mentioned? And that's where the scoring on those transparency items have been quite lacking. So that's where Tesla scores not very well. We also see that the basic idea around companies entering into a market with the idea to decarbonize, I think that's different to Tesla. I think from Tesla point of view, it's very much technology driven rather than from a climate perspective. And that's where we hope that with these benchmarks and these engagements, that they would become more transparent and use their influence actually to also drive the industry further to a low carbon transition. So that's why they've not scored very well on all modules. And I also saw one question about the engagement with governments to push policy. As I mentioned, we have a policy unit established, and what we have active engagement with policymakers. It's fair to say that at the moment, the most feedback we have with the European Commission, especially around the European Green Deal, and last week we had a long discussion with the Diederik Samson, who's the head of cabinet for Frans Timmermans, so to support any work on the Green Deal, to also see how can our benchmark provide a feedback loop potentially for any companies receiving state aid, and how do we look at, if you talk about debt relief or support for companies or specific industries, but also performance to the SDGs, how do you measure that and how do you provide the feedback loop? So that's where we have most active engagement. We see now the engagement in Asia picking up because we just recently established a person who's running our policy work in India. So that's where we see picking up. Although, as you can probably imagine, and I think few of you are in Asia as well, we can't cover the full of Asia. So we've selected a few countries where we have or want to build the capacity capacity further, which is India and Japan, for example. Washington, we have a unit where we have, a continuous dialogue, but these are also through general fora that are organized by, for example, the UN.
Okay, hi, Vicky, sorry to interrupt. As we're running a bit late and it's 1:45, and I know that we've got another one, what I'd like to do is, obviously really appreciate your efforts, and then we'll come back to all the questions. We can get the questions and we'll reply to all of them, and we can do a written reply, because obviously we need to move on. But I'd really like to thank you and Nathan, and obviously there are lots of questions and a lot of interest, so it's been fantastic. And obviously we, as a Cambridge Institute Sustainability Leadership alumni, it's always great to hear one of the alumni come back and talk to us. But thank you very much, and I do think we have to move on because otherwise we're going to lose a few people at 9 o'clock, and we also have Meine's presentation. But once again, thank you very much, and thank you all for the questions. And there'll be a recording, and the questions will be relayed afterwards. Bruno, can we maybe put on Meine's presentation, please, and then I'll introduce Meine. And maybe Vicky and Nathan can just to have a last farewell or a call to action if they want to.
Thank you all.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, so while Bruno's putting up Meine's presentation, so Meine is a business developer at CSR Netherlands, or MVO Netherlands, and it's one of the initiatives of FutureProof Coffee Collective and the True Cost Accounting Program for the coffee value chain. And Meine has years of experience with SMEs, sustainability programs, and transition management in the agri-food sector. And he currently works with over 25 Dutch companies and a number of knowledge partners to bring this the true price and the hidden costs of production into the limelight. And Meine, over to you. Thank you very much, and thanks for all the.
Thanks, Grant. Well, thank you for having me. It's very interesting to hear the last speakers on their subject of benchmarking, something that we are also involved in on a different scale, but still it's interesting to hear the experience and the activity on that subject. My name is Meine van der Graff, as Grant already said. I'm a business developer at MVO Nederland, CSR Netherlands. We are part of a network of CSR organizations brought together in CSR Europe, who are based in Brussels. We are the largest network of companies working on CSR in general, so at least in Europe. Around 2,000 companies pay an annual fee to be partner in our network. The largest part of those companies are small and medium-sized companies, so our focus is on them. Because what we saw in the past is that big companies, as the people in this meeting probably acknowledge, have their own CSR or sustainability departments and their own managers on board, where you see that smaller and medium-sized companies often don't have that capacity. So the owner or somebody from sales has CSR or sustainability on their plate. And because of that, we saw that there was a need to organize smaller and medium-sized companies to get more from their ambitions, because in a lot of cases, these companies have the heart in the right place and they really want to make a difference, but often it's difficult because of their size and scale. So as you see here, there's a lot of companies in that network. As the name says, MVO Nederland is focused mainly on Dutch companies, but we also have a network of multinationals that are partnering, so the Dutch parts of those companies are often linked to our network. So you also see a number of bigger international companies in there. Next slide, please, Bruno. Or do I get to do it myself? Oh, there it is. Okay, so one of the things we do as an organization for our international component is that we assist Dutch companies when they're reaching out to, or when they want to analyze their value chain. So we have a very easy tool. We developed that for companies to do a really rough first assessment of the risks in their value chain. By entering a country and a product, you get a PDF with the biggest risks that you will encounter in that specific environment. and also a number of steps that you can take to mitigate those risks. This tool is being used voluntarily by a lot of companies, but also as a must in some governmental tooling, or for instance subsidies that the Dutch government hands to companies. They need to do the risk check before they can apply. So that's one thing on the side of risk management, and the larger part of what we do is try to get sustainability and CSR into the working environment of an entrepreneur. So in the next slide, we see that what we try to do is try to get companies that are either in the process of making their core business more sustainable, or companies that really have sustainability in their core process, to match them to companies internationally to get solutions and challenges matched. So we do a lot of matchmaking for smaller and medium-sized companies, for them to get their sustainable solutions to specific issues, to get those matched with places where there's the challenges. So we do that in India. We do that sometimes based on a country focus, sometimes based on a product focus. So in that regard, next slide, we see that for coffee, we saw that there were a lot of small and medium-sized companies that are involved in sourcing coffee, roasting coffee, and distributing coffee in the Netherlands, worldwide, but in our case, we focus on the Netherlands. And we saw that a lot of these companies have their own approach to sustainability and their own approach to value chain responsibility. But that we thought and we saw that there was a lot of opportunities being left unused because of the fact that these companies are very difficult to organize, and the firing power of one SME is relatively low, as you might understand. But then our presumption was that if you are able to organize them in a good way, then you will create more firepower, more critical mass to make a difference in the sector. And we got together with around 20 Dutch companies and decided that what was missing is a framework specifically usable and developed and designed for SMEs on this side of the value chain, but also on the other side of the value chain, so producing countries, to get insight in the impact of production, and also get insights in the impact of specific interventions in your production. So what does it do to your negative impact if you start working on, for instance, water treatment or soil treatment? You can do that because you know it's good, but in a lot of cases, there is a lack of options to measure the positive impact of such an intervention. Next slide, please. So in this network, we have right now about 25 Dutch companies. A couple of companies are banging on the door to become part of this network. Most of them are small to medium-sized. A number of them are traders. A number of them are roasters or retail. And we have one big company, which is Maas. That is a big distributor of machinery and services to B2B customers. So there's more or less sort of the big partner in this network that provides us with some options also to reach that side of the market. And on the right side, you see our partners. We are funded partly by the Dutch government and partly by these companies. So they pay an annual fee to be part of this network, and the government pays a subsidy to make the tooling, to develop the tooling, but also to give some seed funding to specific initiatives of these companies. TruePrice, Soil & More, and Solidaridad are our knowledge partners, as well as EY, building the tooling. Next slide, please. So an example of the result, as soon as so we're building a tool, which is for now built in Excel, which a contact of mine had a metaphor for using Excel as an environment for tool building, and he said it's more or less like a Kalashnikov. It's not very fancy, but it's very reliable, and so Excel is what we're working with right now until we're certain that the methodology behind it is waterproof, and then we will start to find ways to make it into a more fancy web-based tool. But for now, a producer, a cooperative, will receive a Excel tool and will fill in all different kinds of footprint data, and the tool itself will then calculate what is the monetarized component of that footprint. We've chosen for 5 indicators, which I will explain a bit later, but here you can see the value for instance, Colombia, where we're focusing on climate change, soil erosion, biodiversity loss, living income gap, and a little bit above you would have seen water use as well. And here you can see how this farmer, in this instance, compares to the benchmark for Colombia. So the orange graph is the benchmark, and the blue graph is this specific farmer or this specific cooperative, showing the price components of the costs that are not included right now in the cost price. So it's all about calculating with this true cost accounting the value of these hidden costs. So what impacts are now not included in the price, and how could you monetize those? That is what we try to do, and that gives the farmer a lot of insight in where is his hotspot of his impact, providing him with the options to take interventions, but it also provides the value chain partner on this side of the value chain, so the roaster or the trader, with input in his discussions with his customers to decide on the price for the product, but also deciding on how to work together in the value chain to bring down those hidden costs. Next slide, please. So here are a couple of examples from farmers in one group of farmers in Colombia that we did the first preliminary research with the first version of the tool. And there you see, for instance, that this farmer compares to the benchmark, having a relatively low impact on climate, because his impact is like 28 cents on a kilo, where the assessments for the benchmark showed that in general for Colombia, the negative impact on a kilogram of coffee would be €1.24. So here he scores relatively low compared to the benchmark. And so you can also look at soil erosion and biodiversity loss. Here it says onderverdiening, which is the Dutch term for a living income gap. And water use. As you probably will see, this is not a complete tool as of yet. So there's a number of indicators that are not included for the producer, such as health and safety, water pollution, and we also see that, for instance, biodiversity should be more elaborate and is relatively simple for now. But for the first version, we are relatively happy that it works. So this is what you get for a group of farmers. They get some insights, compare themselves to the benchmark of Colombia in general, which is relatively, it's very general, so it doesn't say that much. But what's more important and more interesting is that these farmers get to compare themselves with their neighbors, and then you get a picture of, for instance, a producer group. Next slide, please. So take a step back and look at why we're doing this. In the long term, if you look at the left side, this is an excerpt from our theory of change. On the long term, we want to work on recovery of natural and social capital in the coffee sector, and we want to use or work together with as many small and medium-sized companies as possible, because we see that there is a lot of change power or a lot of power to transition there that is being unused. Very important in that is that the coffee producer is an equal partner in the value chain, and that is more or less also a selection criteria to work with these Dutch or European coffee companies, that they have that same approach to their value chain in order to make them work together with us and to make sure that it's all relatively clean. In the end, what is needed to do that is to create more demand for coffee with a true price. So you can calculate the price for the true price for coffee, but if nobody is willing to pay that, then you will have a nice story to tell, but not very much impact. So we're also working on market demand for coffee with at least with a higher price tag and with a methodology behind it to bring down the hidden costs of production. To make that work, we need more collaboration with different stakeholders in the market. So government, knowledge partners, local organizations, local, for instance, in Colombia, we're working with the FNC, Federación de Cafeteras Nacional, or the other way around. As a first step, as I showed, we decided to develop a true cost accounting tool that provides the two ends of the value chain, so the producers on one end and the roasters and the traders on the other end, with the same language and with the same insights about production. Next slide, please. I see a number of questions coming in. I will answer them afterwards if that's okay with you. But please keep on adding questions. So why do we think this works out for these coffee companies, and why do we see so much enthusiasm with these coffee companies? That's because of a number of issues that are playing in this sector. The first is that there is a price crisis which is ongoing. Sometimes the coffee price peaks, but most of the time it's relatively low and under pressure. And if you look at the cost price of coffee production, actually the last 13 years, the price for coffee has hovered around about that cost price in a lot of countries. So in other words, coffee producers are not earning anything. They're just making just enough money to keep their head above water. And in a lot of cases, they're making less than their cost price. And in that sense, you could say that they are subsidizing our coffee habit. So we're drinking coffee in the office, and the producer is subsidizing our cheap coffee by not earning enough to make ends meet. This leads to the fact that things that come from climate change are coffee producers are on the one hand, as are all agricultural producers, part of the problem, but they're also the people and the players that have the most impact of climate change, and they have no resources to work on mitigating the climate change. So rising temperatures, more frequent pests, and longer droughts make it very difficult for them to anticipate on how to produce their coffee. So they're the ones that are getting the biggest impact from climate change. And at the same time, you see that on producing side and on market, on demand side, you see that there's a market consolidation happening. So big traders and big roasters are taking larger parts of the market into their hands, and that provides difficulties for the smaller companies that are in our network to make a difference, because they have very little influence in the sector, and the influence of, for instance, JDE, Douwe Egberts, Dutch company, is very big. And you see in the market here that they set the rules for the market, and one of their rules is that coffee should be cheap, and they are making sure that everything works in their advantage. So it's very difficult for small companies with a specific mindset to break through. So those are the things that provide us with good fertile ground, as to say, to bring these companies together. Next slide, please. So as I said, we've got 5 indicators: living income, climate change, biodiversity, soil quality, and water use. A couple are still on our wish list. And as I said, companies get to compare themselves to a rough benchmark that we have provided. Next slide. I will skip this one due to time. Next slide, please. Okay, so for now we've got 25 Dutch coffee companies that are involved. We've got about 5 waiting in line, because we're starting to focus next to Colombia, also on Peru and Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi as focal countries. So the 2 coffee producing countries right now are Colombia and Peru. We're starting to add 3 more. 70 plus would be around 120 now. Farmers have tested the first version of the tool, and the second enhanced version is now ready and being rolled out. We've got a number of projects that we're also funding, and that's interesting, I think, because we don't just do the measurements, we also stimulate these smaller and medium-sized companies to get into action with their value chain partners. So we've got around 4 projects right now that we're funding that aim at making a transition, for instance, to organic production from normal coffee production to organic, and measuring what is the impact of that transition. Another one is building a central composting factory for a region of coffee producers, for them to get less let them make less use of chemical fertilizers, so that they can make a transition to that. And another one is crop diversification, another project where we aim at adding cocoa and moringa to the coffee farms, so that they have more diverse income, but also from a climate change perspective, that biodiversity will be enhanced. And also so there are different kinds of impacts in these projects, and we'll be aiming at measuring those with the tool. In order to keep everybody together in this network, we have a couple of principles which I could elaborate on a lot more, but in short, those are aiming for a true price of coffee. We all underscore the need for collaboration and transparency and traceability. We join hands in communication, so everybody gets to do their own communication and marketing, of course, but we do have a specific joint message that we send out, and we also, as a network, provide with communication materials for that. And as I showed, we don't wait for the methodology to be totally thought through and everybody discussed it on a scientific level, but we start off immediately by working in the field to bring down these hidden costs, because if it's $1.20 or $1.25 or maybe $2 for climate change in the price of coffee, that doesn't really make a difference, in the sense that you know that there is hidden costs in that area. And small and medium-sized companies, they don't want to wait too long. A lot of cases, these are entrepreneurs. They want to get into action and get into start working. Next slide, please. So what we're doing right now is expanding the network. We're working on the design of an online application, working on sector expansion. So looking at tea, cocoa, textile sector also, to see if we can, if there's the same kind of elements there available and the same necessity to work in this way. It's ongoing, working on different kinds of indicators to add to the tooling, geographic expansion, as I said, and very important, organizing locally, because what we see is we have a network here. They work together. There are things happening that we didn't think about beforehand. So there are new things are happening within the network. New initiatives are being developed. For instance, in the field of agroforestry in Brazil, companies are working together to work on pilots for agroforestry, et cetera, et cetera. And what we see on the other side is that it's, for now, not yet very common that producers organize themselves around sustainability. So all the companies that are now working with us on the tooling through our network here, in Colombia, we will start to organize them as well to at least create sort of a community of practice there, because these are all front runners on the production side as well, and we need to put them on a pedestal and get their ideas and their knowledge out in the producing world as well. Next slide. It's still in there. So I said already, next indicators, we can skip this one. Geographical expansion, we're looking at, for now, Ethiopia, Kenya, Indonesia, Uganda, and Peru. Because in the end, if you want to build this kind of tooling, you would need to be complete for all the big countries producing coffee, because as most of you will know, if you have a coffee in the office, a good chance that there's like coffee from 3 to 5 different origins in there. So if you would want to do this in a good way, then you would need to be able to do this assessment for all those different origins. Next, please. network expansion, will be also aiming at expanding this network outside of the Netherlands. So that's something that we're on the verge of doing. We have a lot of interest from companies that are in one way or the other linked to the companies that are already in the network from outside of the Netherlands. And we're now working on a model that it will be possible for instance, Belgium, German, Danish, English companies to join this initiative. Next slide, please. I already said we're also looking to make sure that there will come an online application, because in the end, if you want to do this thoroughly, you will need to be able to save the data from individual farmers in a central on a central area, because it would be in the end the best if you can start working on that benchmark that we did roughly right now, but fill that with the data from the different farmer communities that have used the tooling, so that in the end they will create their own benchmark, for instance, for a cooperative or for a production region. So we see the necessity for an online application, but for now we don't have the funding on the one hand, and we still need to, we believe we need to finalize or to make the tool better. Next slide, please. So I think an interesting point here is also to discuss, we have a very diverse audience right here, right now, and we are very interested in doing that sector expansion, as I already said, looking at other sectors that could potentially be interesting to approach in a similar manner. Well, my question also to the audience here is, would you see in your sector or in your branch the potential for this approach, based, as I already said, on an SME focus, bringing together these front runners to make a difference, and also working with your value chain partners to bring these hidden costs to light, and specifically to act on bringing down those hidden costs. So this is what we're doing. It's growing a lot faster than we had anticipated, companies are very much involved. So that's, in our opinion, one of the signs that we're doing something right. Well, that was my pitch, and hopefully I already saw a couple of interesting questions coming by. So maybe somebody wants to. This is an oversight of what I just said. So probably Grant will share the slides with you, and then this one will provide you with an oversight of what we're doing. If there's anybody who wants to comment through the microphone, please do, or add questions in the chat. I will start. Yeah, great.
Thanks very much, Meine. They're fantastic and great, and obviously following up with the benchmarking. This is also quite a practical one, which we love. There are a large number of questions. I think we've probably got time for 2 or 3 or 4, and then we'll obviously get back to people as well. The one I thought was quite interesting is with your 2,000 SMEs, how are you seeing yourselves as bargaining with legislation or political influence? And obviously now you're talking about different countries, Colombia, Peru. Yeah. Global South. With
that's a super interesting.
How do you see that move?
It's a good question. So we do that in different ways. So we recently merged with an organization in the Netherlands called the Green Business, or the Green Cause, depending on how you. It's double meaning, and their focus or their purpose is to lobby in the Netherlands, but also in Europe, on European Union level, for specific changes. When you apply that to the coffee sector, there's a number of things going on. We are in contact with an organization in the Netherlands that works on I don't know the English term. It's called mededinging, which is about making price arrangements. So they're the watchdog for making sure that companies don't build cartels or. We're in close contact with them because we think and we believe there needs to be room within the legislation to make specific deals within a sector or arrangements in a sector, as long as you can show that there's a higher purpose to that, sustainability purpose to that. So in that sense, we're working in this project for coffee with the Dutch government to provide room for this initiative, so that they can, within the network, they can make They can talk about price. They can talk about price setting of green coffee without getting into trouble in that regard. So that's how we work on that. If you look at it from a bargaining power perspective, I have one example. Just recently, we had an advisory consultancy project for a part of the Dutch government called Rijkswaterstaat, which builds all the roads and the infrastructure in the Netherlands. They were on the point of procuring their coffee. And we got into contact with them just in time to advise them on how to do that and make sure that within the procurement, they do not ever again give companies the opportunity to compete on the price of green coffee. So take that out. So in the procurement, the Dutch government has set a price, or at least some wishes about how the price for the green coffee should be formed. A minimum price with additional components, and also the requirement that that companies work together with a value chain partner to bring down the hidden costs of production. So in that sense, we created a market opportunity for the companies in our network with that procurement, and in the end, we hope, we're not sure yet, but we hope that companies from this network will win that procurement because they are the ones that have the value chain initiatives up and running, and they have the contact and they have the transparency in place. So we're trying to make in these procurements the government, but also big banks and big companies in our network ask different questions in the procurement so that companies that are sticking their necks out will get business opportunities from that as well. So that's the way we do that.
Okay, and another, thanks, Meine. Another one was how big an impact is COVID, and then the other one was also how, because the amount of the living wage is so critical. How are you seeing that trending at the moment, from your initial results?
Well, we see a big difference between the different cooperatives. So one of the things we saw is that a couple of groups of producers that are relatively far off in what used to be militarized zones in Colombia, they have a relatively big living income gap due to the fact that there is a number of value chain parties more there than in other examples. So there's more people involved in the trade of coffee getting from that area to the port. And people are chipping off of the free on board price. So in that sense, you see that there is a difference within Colombia in the living income gap. But in general, you see in coffee in general, not only in Colombia but worldwide, there is a living income gap, and that would mean that in the end, generally speaking, coffee would need to be on a kilogram of green coffee. You would need to add maybe it's right about now about $2.80, maybe $2.20, hovering between that, but it should be around $4 a kilo to make good for that living income gap in general. And if then you calculate it to a cup of coffee, that because then the added value for coffee is mainly in roasting and marketing and trading. So for a cup of coffee, that doubling of the green coffee price would mean just a couple of cents on a cup of coffee in the end. So we look at it from COVID perspective. We thought that the coffee price would go down relatively steep, but I think due to a flee from a number of other commodities, you see that coffee price has been relatively stable and relatively high during the last couple of months. So that's one thing that is good for coffee farmers, of course. But we also suspect that there will be effects in the mid-long run on the price of coffee. So we're not sure that COVID will have a positive or a negative effect. People keep drinking coffee, so that's positive. On the other hand, it's difficult right now. For instance, in Peru, the lockdown is very, very thorough. People are scared. People are staying on their farms, and the harvest time is coming soon. So a lot of companies in the network are anxious to see how COVID will affect the flow of product in the coming period.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. And another one. How can this work deliver value to the farmer in a non-segregated supply chain?
You would need to help me out with non-segregated, because I don't know that term.
is Kathy still there? Or okay, let's just move on to another one. Kathy, if you could just put it in. I think the other question we had here was, is your tool based on the LCA approach, modelizing data into impact and then monetizing the impact?
Correct. Well, partly I would need to get back on that, but I know that LCAs are the LCA approach is the basis of the work that EY does. That's the school that they come from, and in the end, you're right that you take the footprint data from the LCA approach and you monetize those based on available methodologies. For carbon, it's relatively easy. For other indicators, it's more difficult. For instance, biodiversity is one that we have a lot of discussions about, because what is your starting point and what do you how do you monetize the loss of biodiversity? Do you look back at the way a landscape used to be a couple of hundred years ago, or do you look at the surrounding areas? So the monetizing is the hard part, the LCA part. So the footprint part is relatively easy, but still it's difficult to get to a consensus about what should be the monetization of these components. But I think, in general speaking, the LCA approach is the way this tool was built up. Yes.
Yeah, just go back to the non-integrated. I think they also use that in palm oil as well. They see that as a way that also in the palm oil. Sorry, I don't have the exact definition, so I can't help in that one. But sorry for that. Yeah, I think there's a few other little questions, but once again, I mean, we've got like another 5 or 10 minutes where we do normally do a little bit of networking at the end. But Meine, I wanted to thank you very much, and also your questions and your participation, and there's been some rave reviews in the chat, and we'll come back to you with a few of those questions. And obviously, Sustainavistas, we'd like to continue this discussion, because you're only our first repeat speaker.
Oh, right. Oh, that's an honor. Yeah.
So when you spoke to us about in June, we really wanted to get you back, because you announced this in June last year that you were going to Colombia to set this all up, and it's really exciting to see how you guys have developed, and
yeah.
I'm very glad that it's been very successful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you for having me.
And guys, just a quick announcement. Obviously, we've got two webinars coming up in July, the first one will be on sustainability leadership by Green Gorilla, which will be a very active workshop in July. And then the 19th one will be on design transition from Jeroen van Aert from Fabriek, and he's a professor at TU Delft. So those are two coming up in July. Once again, I would like to thank you all for participation. For those that are interested, we're going to put ourselves into little breakout rooms so everyone can say hello and meet and greet. And Meine, you're more than welcome to stay behind and be put into a breakout room. And it's like luck of the draw to see who you get put into the room with, so there can be some discussions in as well. But we're just going to have like 5 or 10 minutes of networking at the end. And once again, people, thank you very much. And hopefully we'll meet online again and talk soon.